As Greg just said, he did a little introduction, a little bit more about Angela's current positions. Columbia Business School, 37 Angels. Before we get into some of that stuff, I was hoping we would like to get to know you a little bit better. And I wanted to know if you could tell us about, because you've also started companies, as Greg had mentioned. You're not just an investor and an educator, but you're also a startup founder yourself. So tell us a little bit about how you got involved in entrepreneurship. Maybe that's a story about your first startup or your first entrepreneurial experience.
Yeah, so I was 19. I went to Berkeley, and so it was the dot-com era in the Bay Area. And we started realizing that we were making all these connections between startups who needed C++ programmers and Oracle DBAs. And for whatever reason, kind of accidentally created this startup that was a technical recruiting company, technical consulting company, again in the late 90s, where money was falling from the sky and everyone had a foosball table was the thing at the time. And my favorite story about this is we had no idea what we were doing. And I realized that nobody would ever trust me, as I was the chief marketing officer, would ever trust me as, one of the co-founders of this company. And so there were 4 of us that were co-founders, and we each had 4 business cards. And mine in particular, so I had a CMO card, a VP of marketing card, and a director of marketing card. And depending on how senior the person was, I would give them a more junior card, because if I handed them a director of marketing card, then they might think, oh, there's somebody managing this person. There was not. It was just me. But that was kind of like the craziness and the frenzy of the time, but also like we were very much building it as we were building it as we were running it. And then my other favorite story about this is our name was Camera Ready Production Designs, which doesn't really make any sense now, but there was a reason for it at the time. But we bought the URL, and about 3 months later, we realized Camera Ready Production Designs, as we just got the acronym, is crap designs. And we didn't realize it for about 3 months. And I just share these things because we just had no idea what we were doing, but it was a fun time. I was very fortunate and I then graduated, had a full-time job, and just couldn't handle kind of having 2 jobs. So sold my portion of the company, and very gratefully was very lucky. And then unfortunately, we all know what happened in the dot-com crash, but 100% luck on my end, not skills.
So crap designs.
Yeah, crap designs. No longer exists.
Excellent. So it sounds like the little story you told about the different business cards.
Yeah.
It sounds like that might have informed a lot of the work that you've done in the rest of your career, especially with 37 Angels. Is that true? Or
yeah, I think hustle has been a part of it. Greg said tenacity. I think hustle has very much been a part of everything that I've done. I get asked a lot, how do you teach at Columbia? And I bugged a lot of people for about 3 years until finally somebody got desperate enough to let me teach. And it was, actually the first time I taught was at NYU. It was August 17th, and I'd been bugging them for about 2 years. And they're like, get out of here, you have no business teaching. It was August 17th. They're like, our marketing professor bailed on us. We have a marketing class starting in 2.5 weeks. Can you teach a course on consumer behavior? And I said yes. And so I was building the course kind of about 3 weeks ahead of my students. And I think there's a lot of that in entrepreneurship, right? Building it as you do it and hustling it and figuring out as you go along and like acting as if. That has been very consistent in my career. I think people talk a lot about the imposter syndrome, like it's a bad thing. I think it's a great thing. Because being uncomfortable is where you grow.
So you have a title right now of Chief Innovation Officer for Columbia Business School.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What is your
It's the title they give you when they don't know what to do with you anymore. So I'm responsible for teaching quality and teaching innovation. So how we teach and what we teach. So as a business school, what courses should we be teaching? So we just added a whole slew of technology courses like Python coding, R. We have a databases course, which might be surprising, and it was actually a little bit difficult for some of our faculty to accept that we'd be teaching coding classes at a business school. So that's a conversation that I'm a part of. And then how we teach is both just kind of delivery in the classroom, how do you think about engagement so people don't fall asleep, and then online learning. So how you teach and what we teach. That's my role at Columbia, which is the most amazing job in the world.
So you teach, most of your students, they want to be entrepreneurs, I assume, if they're in Columbia Business School and taking your classes, right?
So I teach a leadership class, a strategy class, and then a course called Seed Stage Investing, which is probably most relevant to this group, which is how to invest in startups. And that third class is probably about a third startups who want to understand how the investors think, about a third people who want to go into VC and angel, and then a third people who just want to kind of understand the ecosystem, because obviously I think everyone's interested in entrepreneurship these days.
Okay.
Yeah, no. I'm interested in, it sort of relates to the conversation we had this morning in the first panel, and you mentioned a term that I have a lot of affection for, which is hustle.
Yeah.
By the way, Desh Deshpande, we saw him speak a couple years ago, and he said that the best entrepreneurs have to be a little naive in order to be successful, because if they knew all the risks, they wouldn't do it. So I love that. So when you're coming, I did not go to Columbia, but I would assume from the folks that I know who did go there, you've got rooms filled with very high performers who are used to, in many ways, being at the very top of their game. Sometimes that's hustle. Sometimes that's a mix of things. How do you communicate to folks who are used to being high performers what the traits of hustle are?
That's a really good question. So I think I spent a lot of time, business school students, and like business schools in general, I think are known for spending a lot of time like in the classroom and coming up with their business plan. And I think, I work with a lot of students who are, great at Excel documents and I think working on their business plan is creating, a sensitivity analysis with however many cells and columns. And it's really about getting out there. So we talk a lot about just getting outside of the classroom. And I think that's how we just teach it. So their homework is you have to talk to 20 customers, or your homework is you have to go talk to a founder, and you have to, as opposed to thinking about, well, what's the, green juices? We get pitched a bunch of green juice companies, right? So as opposed to saying, okay, let me start Googling how many green juice companies, go to a Whole Foods and just stand in front of that rack, and you will very visually understand what your competitive landscape is. And so I think it's just a lot about getting out of the classroom.
I heard another interview with you where you talked about another strategy that you often impart to founders, and that's actually sounds counterintuitive to what you're just talking about hustle, it's be lazy.
Yeah.
So tell me about the philosophy there.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about being like the lazy hustler, which is how do you have the maximum impact with minimum effort. And so lazy is just how do you, actually Suzanne was saying this earlier about getting to that go, no-go point earlier. And so how do you figure out if this is a bad idea in the laziest way possible? And so that's the language I use. And so, for example, like 37 Angels, we've been told a lot we need to do more content marketing, right? So I should be writing a blog. I am not a writer like you, and blogging is hard for me. And so we're like, well, how do we experiment and figure out if this is something that we should be doing? And I could do guest blogging, I could write a column in in some editorial. There's all these things that I could be doing. And so we decided to just for a little while add onto our website blog. Right? And then we would put coming soon, and we would see if anybody clicked on that. Nobody clicked on it, right? So at least we know that that's not the place to put our blog. And so as opposed to saying, I'm going to launch a blog for 2 months and see what the response rate is, just see does anyone even click on that link? And so how do you figure out ways to answer those questions as lazily as possible while still being a hustler? Because we all have so little time. And so how do you make that time really effective?
Right. You want to jump into 37 Angels?
Yeah,
I'd like to hear more about what you're doing with 37 Angels. Tell us about kind of the decision-making process that went into you founding this group.
And I feel bad because I feel like I don't know where to look, but I'll try to make
you can talk to them.
Yeah. So 37 Angels is two things. We're an angel network, and then we're an angel education program. So the network is, we have 70 investors in New York City. Actually, about a dozen of them are outside of New York City. And we look at a couple thousand startups a year and invest in 10 to 12. So we have 42 portfolio companies. And we are relatively sector agnostic, investing $50,000 to $200,000 into primarily seed stage companies. I'm happy to get more into that. And then we also have an angel bootcamp. So we teach people how to invest in early stage startups, primarily women, because we're trying to close the gender gap in angel investing. I'm sure a lot of you know the numbers in VC are 4 to 7%, depending on how you count. And angel investing is a little bit better. It's about 18% are women, but we're trying to close that gender gap.
Those data points, those are the percentages
of the investors.
Of the investors. Mm-hmm. So a partner with investing responsibility at a VC firm. So
correct.
Okay, so 4 to 7. Okay.
What are when you in that work? There's obviously people who self-select and that they want to be an investor. I think one of the conversations I've at least heard about is some of the social and cultural barriers to women deciding they may have the means to be an investor, but some other conditions about why they don't want to do that. Have you run into that?
Yeah, so a couple things that I kind of see anecdotally and then I'll quote more of a study. So like anecdotally, I see this all the time with women where they're like, oh, I invested in a couple of companies, but I'm not an investor. I mean, we had a woman who went through our bootcamp. She invested in vitamin water. That's a phenomenally successful investment. She's like, but I'm not an investor. Whereas I see a lot of men, right? Like they maybe wrote one investment 5 years ago, but they'll totally wear that investment hat.
Yeah.
I think there is that willingness to kind of say that you are. And the thing about angel investing is none of us have any idea what we're doing, right? And so if anyone like tells you that they do, like none of us have any idea, and we're all underqualified to do it. And so I think women are, again, I hate to draw vast generalizations, but more willing to, they're just more acknowledging of that lack of knowledge. And
They're more honest, you mean?
well, the study that I was going to quote, it's always going to be backed up by data when you're making potentially contrarian comments, is HPS did a study where, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, that women won't apply for a job unless she's got 10 out of 10 of those qualifications. Men will apply if they've got 6 out of 10, about on average. Now, I'm not saying one's better than the other, but they are different, right? And so I think that's what we mostly see. It's not around lack of writing checks or that, but it's just the like calling themselves an investor. I think that's something that we have to get more women to do.
Getting back to the imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you referenced a couple of the data points around the investors, that pay gap. One of the, I think we can talk about the causal relationship to the number of women-led startups that are receiving the VC and angel investing, because that's often those two are connected. So a recent using Crunchbase data, TechCrunch did a report last year that said 10% of global VC funding between 2010 and 2015, 10% were received by startups with at least one woman founder, and it's higher. It's about 17% for seed and angel funds. So if we're talking about these data points, can you help us unpack a little bit these numbers and what kind of conclusions we should be drawing, and then we can get into solutions. But
yeah, so there's a lot of talk around unconscious bias, and I'm happy to get into all that. I think the main reason is that early stage funding is still very much a network game. Right, it is very much about who you know, and our personal statistic, because I have that data, is we have 42 portfolio companies. 36 of them were referred to us by somebody that we know. And our deal flow at this point is actually about 2/3 unreferred, yet the vast majority of our portfolio came from somebody that we know. It's probably because we'll take a closer look if somebody that I trust sends me a deal. And at the end of the day, our networks look like us, right? And so I think that's where a lot of the bias comes into. And so I think that's a lot of the reason why you see that is people invest in people who look like them, because that's what their networks look like.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So how do we change that?
So the way that we change that, quota is a very ugly and scary and loaded word. And so I think that having like a quota of what you can invest, what you should invest in, I think is a scary thing. But I think what there's almost no downside in is a pipeline quota, right? A pipeline quota is I look at 2,000 deals a year, X number have to be from minority founders, from women founders, from LGBT founders, whatever kind of subsect you want to look at. I have to have an X percentage that I look at. And then paired with that, I have to have as blind of a process as possible. Blendor is a company that's been getting a lot of recent press, Blend OOR, and they do merit-based matching. And the whole idea is how do you blind yourself to the interview process so you don't see the name of the founder, because that tells you gender and ethnic background. Maybe you take school out of it and all those different things. And so, again, something I like studies, in case you guys can't tell. Yeah. I'm sure you guys might have heard of is orchestra auditions, right? They started putting up a screen so you can't see who's playing the violin. And by doing that, the percentage of women in orchestra shot up by 15 to 35% just by not being able to see who is playing the violin or the cello. Right? And so how do you build in blinders into your own process on top of quotas in your pipeline? I think that's the solution I think that solves a lot of it. Because I think the problem is when you get it, and I do a tremendous amount of kind of unconscious bias training and corporate training, and that's all well and good, but that positive intent to overcome bias is hard because our brains are very broken and lazy at the end of the day. And so I like systems and processes that help to break us out of what our brains are doing, not necessarily maliciously.
Mm-hmm. There was also a Bloomberg article recently that talked about, which is, it's not contrary to what we're talking about, it's just an added wrinkle or nuance. It actually said that when looking at the data, women-led startups were actually not more likely to get VC funding from a VC firm with female partners.
Yeah.
And they said one of the reasons is that female VC partners are worried about the appearance of gender being involved in their investment decisions. So it complicates that causal relationship even more. And so we're not going to solve that right now, but there's so many different things going on. I didn't know if there's any truth to that, or you think that's another problem to be overcome? Or...
There is, yeah. I mean, there have been studies to be shown that when a woman or a person of color hires somebody from that same background, they're penalized socially because, oh, you're hiring somebody and it's favoritism. Whereas if a white man does it, it's seen as diversity, right? And that person is given kind of a positive social benefit to doing so. And so I think a lot of women, and I'll just anecdotally say, we're women investors, but we invest in male and female founders. And I have noticed that when I get sent the 18th fashion curation app, my eyes glaze over a little bit because every time, so Manicube was manicures at your home, Glam Squad, V, there's all these beauty product, Uber beauty products. There's a gazillion of them. And literally every time one of those pops up, I get sent it from 6 different investors. And I actually think I'm tougher on those companies, I think just a little bit because of fatigue. And I wonder if those women founders are maybe they keep getting sent, oh, this is a female founder. I'm going to send it to you a bunch of times over. So I just know anecdotally, I have a little bit of fatigue around it where I'm almost just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I only want to invest in beauty apps, right?
Right, of course, yeah.
So when you look at ecosystems, right? So part of what this conference is about is how we build our ecosystem. There's got to be an intentionality around that conversation, though, right? So. And especially in nascent ecosystems, right? Not everybody can do the blind, or maybe they can. But sometimes, I guess, when you mentioned earlier at breakfast that you've been to Madison and Iowa City recently, and these are places that we're similar to in many ways. And all of these places are struggling with this challenge. And I guess the larger question is, does the intentionality of the conversation begin to change that? It's sort of embracing the uncomfortableness of the conversation. Does that make sense? What have you seen in some sort of similar sized ecosystems that people are doing that might be able to change that trajectory of those networks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the intentionality is very much, it does have to start there. I just think it's simply not enough. Right. I think to have positive intention around all of these things is not enough. I think it needs to be coupled with systems and processes that work. But I know this conference, for example, you guys had a pledge to have kind of parity in the speakers, gender parity in the speakers. And I think that starts from intentionality, but then it becomes something tangible. And I think I just want to make sure people aren't only paying lip service to this stuff, but they're also creating actual actions out of it.
One of our partners who helped us identify the 100% gender balances said to me once that a norm has to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And so sometimes if you just keep yelling it as loud as you can, the norm can happen. But I think particularly in smaller ecosystems where there's really an intimacy in these smaller places where people don't interact with people that look different from each other as much. And so I hope that some of these conversations help changing those norms in a different way than systemically, I should say, instead of just anecdotally.
37 Angels, you're not just focused on female investors, but it is a focus. It's not your main focus though. So you have boot camps for female investors. I wonder, and you also obviously teach at Columbia. I was wondering is there a difference between how you teach a boot camp for female investors and how you teach a class at Columbia to business school students?
Yeah, so there's 2 courses that I do this. So I teach a course called The Leader's Voice, which is all about leadership communication, and then I teach Seed Stage Investing, which is how to invest in startups. And in both of these classes, the content in those classes is exactly the same whether I have a room of all men, all women, or mixed. However, what I often do for both of them is I'll do a lunch for the female students or a dinner or something like that, and we'll talk about the things. So I was just talking to Sandy Stone about this around, for example, some of the women in the network might say, well, I want to talk to my significant other about the investment before I make it. And that's a conversation that might not come up in a mixed group, but it's very much a conversation you have to have, which is how do you think about how you have that conversation as a couple, right? So that would be one. Again, in Leader's Voice, we talk a lot about what happens for women if you're too strident, right? It's a very narrow band, and that's a hard conversation to have in a mixed audience. And so I think from a content perspective, it really is exactly the same, but sometimes I think the Q&A, the dialogue, and the struggles people deal with are a little bit different. And so I try to create a safe space to have those conversations.
Right.
So outside of, and we were talking about this at breakfast as well, so the geography of your investments and some of the things you've been seeing, some of these trends outside of New York and Boston, Silicon Valley. What are you seeing out there? Geographic distribution, what do you think the positives, negatives outside of New York?
Yeah, so we in late 2014 made a very conscious effort to look outside of the big cities purely from a valuation perspective. I'm sure all of you know what's happening to valuations. Thankfully, there was a tiny correction in early 2016, forgot what year it was. But we were very conscious about kind of going outside of those big cities purely for valuation, and then as a result was going to Portland, Springfield, Massachusetts, Des Moines, Madison for these conversations. I was in Oslo, Norway for the same reason, and so what I'm finding is that all of these cities are being very intentional by creating, I love the word like ecosystem, right? Because I think the idea of just having accelerators is not enough, just having angel investors is not enough. You have to have corporations, universities, ideally the government, everyone involved. And so what I love about, I'm actually kind of jealous because you kind of get to create this really cool ecosystem from the ground up. I asked over breakfast, like, how many accelerators do you have? We have like 120. You guys have a small handful. Like, I'm kind of jealous in some ways because it's like really fun. Like, I'm a founder. I like creating, and so like
You're welcome to move here. We'd love to have you. Right?
But like you get to be intentional about building that. Like you guys get to create the culture of what the startup ecosystem is. Like what I love about the New York startup ecosystem, and it is less true now than it was 5 years ago, is it's relatively collaborative. Like you wouldn't think it is. It's like New York, we're all tough and mean and whatever, but we are a more collaborative ecosystem than the Silicon Valley. And I think anybody who's worked in both ecosystems would say that. And I think like we got to kind of create that. Like we're all going to syndicate deal flow and share resources and be really collaborative, and you guys get to create that. So I just think it's a cool time to be a part of those ecosystems.
So you said it used to be more collaborative.
Yeah, less so these days.
Yeah, what happened?
I think there's a lot of saturation. I mentioned before. So on our website, we have all of the New York accelerators listed. I think right now we have about 100. And so people are just competing over actually the founders, right? And so it's actually a great time to be a founder in New York. But you call them champions, right? Accelerators, service providers, all those different people that surround the startup ecosystem. It's more and more competitive for them to get access to the best startups. And so the elbows are a little bit sharper now than they were 5 years ago.
Interesting.
Talking about the geographic diversity.
Yep.
So one thing that we talk about in Maine sometimes, and be very interested in your input on, is we talk about bias, gender bias. There's other biases that come into play. Do you think a startup founder that's in Portland or other, Bangor, Maine, is going to face a geographic bias if they, walk into a VC office or in New York, or pitch angels in New York, or Sand Hill Road and Silicon Valley? I mean, is there, are they going to be considered less sophisticated, or does that bias exist, or is it just us making it up?
So I'm going to say something biased, which is that New York investors know, but if you go to Silicon Valley, they will have the bias. But that's my bias in the Silicon Valley, which is like they're like very anti-outsiders, but that New Yorkers are welcoming. I mean, that's, I'm sure, just my own vantage point.
Wow, did you just say New Yorkers are welcoming?
I do think the New York
that's good. No,
startup
that's
ecosystem
totally my
is
bias.
more welcoming than Silicon Valley. I do think that. It's a different ecosystem. But what I'll say is that, so there's a group in New York called Venture Out New York, and they bring international startups from all over the world specifically to New York investors. And so at this point, I have seen maybe like great startups from about 20 different cities kind of come through New York. And what I find over and over again is that the quality of the founders is relatively consistent across any ecosystem. But the pitching differs, right? So New York founders are just better at pitching than I would say people who just don't have, I think, just as much practice pitching. So I think that's the main difference, and I see obviously the valuation difference. But beyond that, I don't think, and maybe I have it and I can't tell because, like, fortunately, bias is unconscious, but I don't think that New York investors have that bias. If anything, I think a lot of New York investors are purposely going outside of New York and Silicon Valley because we recognize that there's all these amazing companies that we're not seeing.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting that you have this program that brings, I don't know if you know, but the Global Accelerator Network ranked New York as a more robust and a stronger ecosystem than Boston, the recent study, particularly because of the engagement of international founders. And that's definitely a place that we have some opportunity to do that. But are you seeing more and more international founders coming through your network?
Absolutely.
What does that add? What does that add to your cohort? What does that add to the community at large, you think?
I mean, I think for the founders, just like marketing techniques, like they just recognize that different things work at different ecosystems. So I think it's great that they get to learn from each other. I do think that international startups also bring international investors, right? So we are also having more and more international investors be interested in New York startups. And so I think it's a win-win. And at the end of the day, like we're all doing this because we love sharing ideas and innovation. And so what better way to do that than in a global ecosystem?
Yeah. One of the things I think that was in that study as well, also highlighted as a measure of aspirations. So those communities, those ecosystems that had more startups with international customers, they ranked as higher growth aspirations because those startups were already looking outside of
Global
their own,
markets,
even regional or national network or customer network by engaging the rest of the world. So it sounds like there's a huge opportunity.
Yeah. I do think that the one place where founders not from the big hubs are most constrained is what I said before, which is networks, which is at the end of the day, a lot of this still does happen by, hey, talk to my buddy from so-and-so. And so I think breaking into those networks, I think is a little bit harder.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I wanted to return to the gender issue for a minute because there was something I wanted to ask you about and I forgot. And you mentioned that it's really hard. It is very hard to generalize. You don't want to make general sweeping statements about female founders. But I have heard you speak about the topic, and there is one piece of advice that you do seem it's important to impart that you do see consistently happening, and that is a piece of advice that you feel more comfortable sharing kind of generally. Can you tell us about that?
So the data shows that female founders ask for less capital, right? Just over and over and over again. And at the end of the day, you need capital so that you can grow at a faster pace and that you can get to your Series A. And so there's a lot of very, very woeful statistics about the number of women founders who get to over $1 million in revenue. And it's because they don't have the firepower, the cash, to get them there. So I spend a lot of time talking to founders like, what do you really need for 18 months to get you to that Series A, and ask for that amount. In fact, ask for 125% of that amount, because founders naturally are optimistic, as opposed to asking for half because you feel bad. So I think there's a lot of that. And then I think anecdotally, something that I do see is that, I think women are just a little bit more realistic in their pitch, right? And so you'll see guys come in and it's much more like, this is if everything goes right, this is what's going to happen. And I think women will kind of pitch the more kind of middle scenario. But I don't know what to do with like that. I have that observation. I don't know what my advice is though. I don't know that my advice is that everyone should be pitching the blue sky, the home run scenario. And I don't know that the feedback is also that you should be pitching the middle scenario. I think that investor-founder relationships, it's like a lot like dating, and you have to find people that kind of sync up with you. And so I actually just say, be authentic, and you're going to find the investor, I think, that matches that personality, because I find some of those people like a huge turnoff, right? But some people are like, I want that person to be really gutsy and aspirational. So I think it depends on the investor.
So you see tons of deals, I'm sure, and you're in the center of the heart of it all, right, New York City. What are the areas of sort of deep innovation and technological advancement that you're most excited about in the next 10, 15 years?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I'm not excited about, which is VR, right? So I think everyone loves talking about virtual reality. And so I think with virtual reality, I think of it as like there's the hardware layer, there's like the content layer, and then there's the software layer. I'm not at all excited about the top and bottom layer. So I think content is very hard as an investor to be like, what's going to be the next Angry Birds? I have no idea, right? And then from a hardware perspective, it's so regulatory, and it's usually, a lot of times, what's successful from a hardware perspective is not about like founder hustle or making the right decisions. It's just around things that are kind of outside your control. But I think that middle layer is interesting in terms of the software that's enabling it. That's one. What I like about artificial intelligence is that for the first time, I feel like people recognize that AI is not like robot companions and robot overlords. It's much more around cost savings, right? So for those of you who've ordered from Amazon and been like, why is my SD card in this huge box? It's because artificial intelligence told them that it's cheaper, right? Operationally, to have 4 sizes of boxes rather than 18 sizes of boxes. Blue Apron, right? They have like, I think 160 data scientists at Blue Apron. Why? Because they're optimizing food freshness and supply chain logistics, all these different things. And so I think for me, what's exciting to me about AI is that like for the first time, there's like a genuine business case to it, and it's not this like crazy thing out there. So that for me is interesting. And then anything in the space of curation, I think as like a consumer, I love. Because we're all completely overwhelmed by just everything in our lives. And so the more you can curate, the better.
So when you say that, you mean personalized products?
Personalized products, introductions, yeah. I think I've like people who could like a smart newsletter that would be like tailored to me. Like I would love that. And then I think the space of actually human interaction is a really interesting one, right? So like a smarter LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is amazing, right? But like I need more texture around it.
I had another question. I was going to bring it back to investing and founding companies. You're obviously an investor now, and we talked a lot about investing today. You've also started multiple companies, and the majority of them you actually bootstrapped, though. You didn't even look for investment. So I was wondering, putting on your founder hat, like talk about kind of your philosophy around that, and if you had any advice about when startup founders should actually think about raising investment from outside investors, and when they should look to bootstrap or just cash flow their business.
So I actually it's weird as an investor, I spend a good chunk of my time talking to founders to say, do not raise capital, right? Because venture capital and angel funding, the pace that we want you to grow at breaks a lot of companies. And I hate the term lifestyle business, right? Because lifestyle business becomes this like ugly, like, oh, I'm running a lifestyle business shamefully and hiding in the dark. And like, why is that? Because there are plenty of lifestyle businesses that make a lot of money. And so I think just the idea that it's like, I raised $3 million, that's the only definition of success. I just wish that was no longer the definition of success. Right. So I spent a lot of time talking about that. And so what I do a lot with founders, especially when you've got co-founder teams, is I'm like, okay, get a Post-it note, right? And co-founder, just write down like, what does success mean to you? Like, where do you want to be in 5 years? How many hours do you want to work a week for the next 5 years, if not longer, right? And then like, what size company do you want to run? And do you want to take vacation? All these different things. And first of all, I say it as a co-founder conversation because if those things aren't aligned, that company's not going to last. But just because like I think people don't really ask themselves, like year 1 of a startup is awesome. Like year 4 is a slog, right? And like you're exhausted and you're tired. And I think people just don't think about that, like what they're going to have to be doing in years 3 and 4 and beyond. And it's all about that like exciting part in the beginning. And the problem with venture capital and angel funding is it's a marriage, right? Like you are in that into the long run, and you just have a lot less control. So I just ask people to really, really think about why they're raising capital. And I don't think a lot of people ask themselves that question. They just think, I have a startup, that must mean I need to raise capital, and that's just simply not true.
So we need to change the definition of success. So it's not, raising around is, not success in itself. So, when you're talking about lifestyle business, that's not you're not saying that lifestyle businesses can't be high growth businesses. It's just that they can still be high growth businesses, right? It's not.
No, absolutely.
Okay, it's not just raising the capital is the only way. Raising outside investment is not the only way to get that high rapid growth into in a competitive market, right?
Right, but the thing about VC is that we need that. So, you'll hear 10% month-over-month growth, 20% month-over-month growth, right? Y Combinator, I think their statistic is it 5% a week? I forget what the Y Combinator statistic is like. Do that math out in Excel. I mean, year 3, that's like crazy growth, right? So, so most companies do this, right? But VC companies need to keep doing that. And that's just not sustainable for every company. Not every market is that big, right? So for 37 Angels, we won't invest if we don't think you can make $25 million a year in year 5. And that's on the low end of the scale. There's a lot of VC firms that bar is 100 million or more. And not all markets are that big. That doesn't mean you can't have a very, very robust, healthy, money-making company, even if it doesn't meet those hurdles.
Interesting. You want to
open it up for questions?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah, right there, okay.
You talked about having the 20th glamour company come in, or whatever the number was. What is 37 Angels? Like I went to Golden Seeds, and great technology. We're a tech-focused company, but we can't help you, was the answer.
Okay.
But you're going to be a great success. We just can't help you because most of the people at Golden Seeds were, marketing people, consumer, fashion, stuff like that, and we're a tech company. So what is the focus for 37 Angels typically?
Just a little context, Kay's company is very tech-focused, very fascinating company, but it's a company that I think you would agree it's kind of sometimes hard to explain to someone who doesn't have a deep knowledge of what you're working in. So I think
distributed intelligence, getting intelligence AI to the edge.
Like at the edge.
Yeah. So I'll answer the question in two ways. One is just like, what is our sector focus? And we genuinely are sector agnostic. So we're happy to see 37 of the 42 are tech, but we are invested in a few consumer products as well. And we are invested in a couple of AI companies as well. So, but we really are genuinely sector agnostic. We like health tech, we like ad tech, and stuff that's servicing the freelance worker. Kind of those are areas that we like, but relatively sector agnostic. But I want to actually answer it in a different way, which is the idea like we can't help you, and the idea of like smart money and people like needing value-add investors. I kind of think it's a load of crock, right? Like I think a lot of founders say like, I want smart money.
Yeah.
You don't need like 18 angel investors like aggressively trying to help you every week. Sometimes you just need the check, right? And so I tell, right? So when I'm advising founders, I spend a lot of time saying like, think about the money you need, right? And think about the 2 or 3 advisors you need, and then sometimes you don't need every single person to be aggressively helping you. And so I think there's a little bit of this like, because it's just for those of you who've been on the other side of this, right? To have like 12 angels calling you every week and be like, hey, have you thought of this? Do you have this idea? What about this? Come talk to my buddy, this person. They're an expert in so-and-so. That's really overwhelming. And so our ethos at 37 Angels is actually a little bit more like we will absolutely help you when you need it. So if you tell us you need introductions to this person, we will give you a list of 40 people to talk to. If you need this subject matter expertise, we'll give you like these 6 people who have that. But we actually try to almost, we have a single point of contact to the founder after we invest. And we actually try a little bit to shield our entrepreneurs from our angels. Because I actually think angels in particular can be like just very aggressively helpful, and without always like thinking about timing.
And they probably feel a little entitled if they're invested in the
Yeah,
company.
some angels think that to invest means that you're now a manager of the company.
Right.
No, you are not.
Right.
So just before Dawn says something, if you have a question before this front row dominates it, because I know they all have questions, I love them all. Just make sure to put your hand up nice and loud and proud, and we'll get you a...
Yes.
So you came of age during the last bubble, and I'd like to get your perspective on where we are overall, and then also since that time, angel investing secularly has grown significantly, and what do you see angel investors' role versus VC going forward?
Ooh, it's a very big question. So first of all, I think the idea of like there used to be like an angel round and a VC round, as a lot of us know, and I think that's less and less true. So angels and VCs are getting very blurry, right? So the only difference I see between angels and VCs, especially angel networks and VCs, is that VCs have raised a fund and they're deploying other people's capital, and angels are investing their own capital. That's like the main difference. But when we invest in a seed round, we're usually investing alongside VCs. So I think timing it's just like it's a seed round and a Series A round, and we'll invest in a Series A as well. And so I think the angel round, VC round is different. I think there's a bit of a like VCs are smart money, angels are dumb money. I don't think that's true anymore. You've got a tremendous amount of very sophisticated angels, many of whom were former founders and operators, who I think add a lot of value. In terms of like the future, I don't know. I do think that there's too much money in the ecosystem, right? There's a lot of companies that are getting funded that shouldn't get funded right now. I'm hoping that will end soon, and I am somebody who does believe that we are frothy and we're bubbly, and I don't think we're going to crash the way we did in 2001, but I think there's going to be a bigger correction than we saw in 2016, and I for one am very much waiting for it because there's too much money in the ecosystem. It's not a very intelligent answer to a very intelligent question.
Hi, Angela. Thanks for joining us. I want to make sure I'm hearing correctly, and I think I've heard you mention 2 thoughts that have caught my attention. One is of how deals get into a pipeline or whatever, and I hear you have quite a structured process, but did I hear correctly that deals seem to surface mostly through somebody you know? And I wonder if you could expand, because that speaks to the old school thought of network, network, network. So I want you to speak to that. And then secondly, I think I heard you make a comment that stopped me cold about basically how I interpreted it is a pitch can make or break you. And that, again, is a real wake-up call. So I wondered if you could speak to us about a little bit more about networking and the importance of that and how you get some attention for your deal to begin with. And secondly, I don't know about anyone else, but I'd sure like to know what you think the top 3 things to do in a pitch would be.
Sure.
Thanks.
Great question. So in terms of networks, just from a volume perspective, in 2,000 deals, 1,200 of our deals are not referred in. People apply to us off of Gust, off of our website. They tweeted us. My phone number is publicly listed on the Columbia Business School website, which I probably shouldn't tell this large of an audience, but it is. So people call me randomly and pitch me. And so that's just totally unreferred. And about 800 deals are referred in, usually via email from somebody we know, investor, founder, accelerator, groups like this. So, but our 36 of our 42 portfolio companies were referred in by someone we know. So what we know is that from a percentages perspective, we are much more likely to invest in somebody that we know. And that might be because the quality of what's getting referred to us is better than what's not. I happen to think it's because we probably take a closer look if it's somebody that we know, right? And so, and I wish that weren't the case. Like, I wish I was fair in the way that I looked at every pitch, but I'm not. By the way, another potentially depressing statistic for you guys is DocSend, which is that document sending tool. They looked at on average how long a VC looks at a deck. 3 minutes is how long they spend flipping through a deck, right? So you do have to capture a question very, very quickly. So I'll talk about the pitch thing later. So in terms of networking, some of you might not know a ton of angel investors, right? So, but that's the glory of LinkedIn, right? So go on to LinkedIn, figure out people who you want to be connected to, find out who you have second and third degree connections in, and ask people to introduce you, right? And write the email for them. This is my startup, I'm Austin so-and-so, forward this to this person at this firm and see if they'll take a meeting. And this comes back to the hustle thing, right? So it's not always, sometimes and I'll get an email where oh, I met this person at a conference, they spoke to me, whatever, they want to be introduced to you. And if I get that a couple of times and somebody really wants to get in front of me, I'll take that meeting. So I think it comes back to that hustle, and the great thing is in 2017, there are tools and events and mechanisms so that I actually think that networks are becoming more democratic because we all just do have access to more people than we did back in the days when we all had Rolodexes sitting on our desks.
It's a great opportunity to say that there is an event, Meet the Maine Angels, which is, when is it? Someone remind me.
Tomorrow night,
Tomorrow night at what time?
5:30,
Where?
There you go.
at the Portland Art Gallery.
Portland Art Gallery?
Yep.
I don't even know where that is. Middle Street. So Meet the Maine Angels. So if you want to hustle,
You can find out all the information on the Maine Startup Create Week website.
obviously on the Maine Startup Create Week website. But anyway, have to register. Okay, but Meet the Maine Angels. So sorry, go ahead.
Nope, that's great. So that's the networking side. On the pitching side, first of all, if you go on a SlideShare and you look at my name, Angela W. Lee, I have 10 slides that investors want to see. So that's what we think is a good pitch. So you can find that on SlideShare. It's just 10 slides investors want to see under Angela W. Lee, my name. So that's one. And then I think the main thing that I see founders make mistakes on is they spend way too much time pitching the product and not the company, right? The product is the thing, the widget, the app, whatever the case may be, but I want to know about the company. So the company is the team behind it. Why are you the right person to be starting this company? The company is also your business model, right? So back to those beauty app, like Opentable for beauty appointments, right? So there are many companies which is, if tomorrow I want to get, a manicure in Portland, Oregon at 3 p.m., sorry, Portland, Maine, so sorry.
No problem.
So sorry.
First person.
I know. Big mistake. At 3 p.m., right, I can get a manicure and go on to, there's many like Opentable for beauty sites. One company that pitched us, the way that they were getting customers was refer a friend, right? So you get $10 if you refer your friend, and they also get $10 off of their manicure. That's one way to acquire customers. The other one was partnering with salon appointment software. And so every time they onboarded one of these software companies, they would onboard all of the salons and then all of those salons' customers. It's a much smarter way to acquire customers, right? And so I don't really care about the interface. That's like a very quick problem to fix, but I care about how you're thinking about acquiring customers. And so mainly it's pitching the company, not just the product.
Excellent. Question in the back.
Now everyone hates me because I said org.
No, we don't hate you.
Yeah, you're totally the first person
Yeah.
ever to make that mistake.
Many VCs say they don't want to invest in a single founder. For example, Foundry says if you are a single founder, go out and find somebody else to join your company. What do you think about this attitude, and also how does that differ in the angel world as opposed to the VC community?
There is a lot of bias against solo founders. So I would say there's two things I would say in response to that. The first thing is if you are a self-aware solo founder, then that's much less of an issue, right? So if you know, look, I am a fantastic, COO or CTO, whatever the case may be, but I need to bring on a strong CMO and chief product officer, and you're very self-aware about your strengths and weaknesses, a lot of that goes away. The second thing is if you can send them an article, it's on Crunchbase, and it's about how the solo founder fallacy is a myth. And what they did, it is a really great study around the percentage of companies that got funded that are solo founders, and then the percentage of successful companies that were by solo founders. And it's about 40% in both cases. And so I think that a lot of investors, myself included, I was in that camp up until about a year ago, until I started to do more research, thought that solo founders were less likely to be successful, but there's data to show that that's not the case. And so send them that article and demonstrate to these investors how self-aware you are, and you recognize, look, I'm really great at this, but I'm going to bring on an incredibly strong person in this and this because those are my two weaknesses. And I think you can overcome some of that.
That affirms the notion of team,
Yep.
right, versus the product that you might have. So how you explain what your team is and what your weaknesses are, and how you demonstrate that sort of reflection is as valuable as anything else.
Correct.
Excellent. Oh, where's Katie, and then Greg up front has one next.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Super valuable discussion. As somebody who was a founder and now on the accelerator side of the equation, it's always struck me that investing in startups is just super kludgy. The system's weird and it's always evolving. But I'm curious if you see some point 10 years from now where things are so much better systematized. And I say that knowing that it's almost ironic to think that we could systematize a grassroots effort, a highly democratic effort in some way to make it work better. But there's all these different steps that don't work. People don't understand how to pitch. They don't understand where to pitch. They don't understand what the money is for at what given stage. They're trying to talk to you, one angel group, another angel group has different ideas. But the people who run how the patterns work and the onboarding process works, just like angel groups and VCs, they control it, just like big companies do in trying to work with these little upstart incumbents. So I'm wondering, are there any changes you see coming where the notion of an incumbent, the notion of somebody coming in and do something different is standard and expected and prepared for?
So one thing that I do think that is changing is it is an incredibly inefficient process for the founder, which is you have to pitch like all these different groups, and it's horribly inefficient. So I think that, at least in New York, but I do think that an ecosystem has to be like to a certain maturity level to recognize this. We're trying to create GAIN, which is Gotham Angel Investment Network, right? And so can we have a consistent application, for example, like a consistent form that you all fill out, kind of like the common app for college applications, something like that for the investment process, and then can we all share deal flow? So I think that's one thing that we're trying to do like at a human level. I think systemically the biggest problem with the ecosystem is just lack of data. But I think Crunchbase, right, is a great organization that's trying to overcome that. The Halo report is another one, and I think that until the data problem gets fixed, I don't know that like all the best human intentions in the world are going to overcome it. Because right now, like it's so hard for me to know like who invested in what, like even like just returns. Like people don't, like returns are very easy to disguise. And so I think like that's another, I mean, you mentioned in terms of startups that like I want to get started would be someone that like can really figure out from a data perspective. How do you get all the data out of people's like hard drives and out into the cloud? But that has to be regulated.
Yeah.
Right now, we have no incentive to share that data.
You're talking about like VC firms talking about returns.
Yeah, it's all
of their
private.
funds.
It's all private data at
Right.
this point, which I understand, but I also wish wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So my question was similar, having to do with working with your angel group working with other angel groups. And I'm wondering, of your startup investments, how many of them are, it sounded like from the small, relatively modest investment size, you must not be the only investors in the deal in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
So of the ones where you're in there and another angel group or maybe two other angel groups are in there, how much of what you're doing is sort of parallel investing and how much of it is sort of collaborative investing?
Unfortunately, and this a little bit answers your question, I would say 80% is parallel investing, only about 20% is truly collaborative investing. I have, and it's not even angel networks, I have people in certain angel networks that I trust. And if they're in a deal, I'll read their diligence memo and I won't do my own diligence, and it truly saves the entrepreneur time. Unfortunately, that's 20% of my investing. 80% of it, I am recreating the wheel. So that poor founder has to send me the documents and that other person the documents, and we're both doing our own diligence, and it's horribly, horribly inefficient, which is why the gain conversation has been happening.
And will that ever get better? Do you see a day when there's true collaboration and a real syndicate of angels? Because that would be powerful.
Yeah. I would love to say yes. But it is such a network-driven process. I don't see it happening in the next like 10 years, unfortunately. I think we're still a ways away from that. And but I hope that I'm wrong.
This question is just getting at, so 37 Angels with the Maine Angels, for instance. If Maine Angels does all the due diligence, and now we've formed a connection with you, they send you that due diligence. It's just a matter of that network, and you know someone, a member of Maine Angels, but you also have to trust that their due diligence is correct, right? So there's a personal relationship. So does it all come down to trust? Is that what's stopping what Greg's asking for? Is it just?
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
know how you overcome that like personal connection.
Yeah.
Because someone could have the most amazing credentials in the world and they have a super successful track record, but I want to know that person. Like
Yeah.
I still personally want to have dinner with that person and get to know their ethos. Because for example, there's been a couple of deals that I've passed on where I probably would have made a lot of money, but I have like a no asshole rule, right? Like I won't invest in that person.
Good rule.
Yeah, and so like, and like that stuff, like I still think it unfortunately comes out through these personal connections, and like maybe that's like a very old-fashioned answer, but yeah.
So is there a business opportunity for a service company to be in the middle and do the due diligence and help the founders of company distribute information to angels, but be a trusted service provider to the angel networks?
Yeah, so there are like broker dealers that exist right now, and unfortunately right now most of them it's actually a negative signal. So if I see a company that is represented by one of those intermediaries, there's a negative signal to me, which says that, well, you needed this intermediary to help you raise funds. And so unfortunately right now, the reputation of that group is negative. Now, I'm not saying it can't be turned around, but that's the way it is right now.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So you mentioned as part of your talk how you're excited for where we are in terms of our development. So if you were building a startup ecosystem from scratch, I mean, what are the constituent parts that you think are really important? Like what should we keep in mind as we're continuing to grow our ecosystem here?
So I think one is just making sure that so if I think I have a slide on this, right, which is surrounding the startups, you've got certainly the funding sources, accelerators, corporations, universities, service providers, and government. Those are the 6. And so I happen to think that you need to get all of those groups involved. And I think what happens is when you have a big imbalance, especially around like funding sources, accelerators, and founders, I think you need to kind of relatively grow them at the same size, because otherwise you've got all these amazing founders that can't raise capital, or you've got all these amazing angels who are like, we need more deal flow. So I think that's where you have to kind of manage pace, and then making sure that everyone else is involved as well. I actually am just curious, in terms of like pulsing the room, who here is a founder? Cool. Who here is an investor or thinking about becoming one? Okay. And then who here is in an innovation role or like an entrepreneur role? I hate that term. At a corporation? Okay.
3, 4.
Not that many. Okay. Just want to get a sense of the room.
And then other service providers, champions.
Champions, that's a good word. Cool. Okay.
That's probably second largest. So a lot of founders. That's awesome.
I know you said you were industry agnostic, but what are the areas that when the deal comes through, right? So there's a lot of conversation about anybody that has to deal with sort of the drug process with the FDA and how it's a disaster. Are there any of those areas that you see that are like red flags to you? Not that you break your rule about sort of looking at every deal, but are there some areas that you're like, that's just a mess?
So there's 2 areas we won't look at. One is hits-based. So hits-based is games, movies, Broadway plays, which is where the term angel investing comes from. So anything brands, like retail brands, we won't look at hits-based industries because it's just very, very hard for me to determine, again, what's going to be the next Candy Crush. And then the other would be anything that's got very, very long lead times, specifically around R&D, and then really high capital expenditures. So life science we don't look at, and we don't look at clean energy. Stuff like that is stuff that we don't look as much in. Yeah.
We have a lot of those businesses in Maine. So
sorry.
no, that's good. But so those companies, is it just angels just aren't a good, or is that specific to your group, or do you think that's pretty general across the board?
I think angels have less appetite for, especially that second one, like just high capital expenditure and really long lead times. I think angels like a quicker turn than VCs. We're not the most patient capital.
Unless they're very focused impact investors who want a clean
but
planet type of
Investor Circle, right, which is they only do social enterprise. There's Life Science Angel Network.
Right.
There's a couple of hardware players as well. So I feel like you have to find people who get you.
Part of that probably comes back to Kay's question, because if you approach, golden seeds, that maybe they're mostly, I'm just making this up because I don't know the makeup of the group, but if they're mostly marketing and this, they're not going to understand that concept that Kay's bringing to the table. So, just to kind of full circle back to your question about, you need to find those angels that are probably subject matter experts in those areas, right? I mean, if you're not a clean energy expert, it's going to be a lot harder for you to understand the potential impact that this startup could have. Anyway, I'm just talking. Joe.
Hi, Angela, you mentioned ad tech. I think I know what ad tech is. What's the difference between ad tech and marketing tech? Because I hear both those terms as we're marketing tech, we're ad tech.
Yeah, I don't know that I would put those probably in the same bucket, right? Which is optimizing how people spend marketing dollars, right? And so, we're invested in Pollen, and for those of you who set up a Facebook ad campaign, there's not that many attributes you can target, and they basically blow that out so you can be very, very precise about who's seeing your Facebook ads. That's ad tech, but I would put marketing tech into the same category.
Any more questions?
I'll make my way back.
Okay. Do you want? Questions?
Mine was less a question, but just to follow up on what we've been talking about today, that there's 2 affiliate events that are really relevant to this. One is tomorrow morning at 7:30 at Red Thread is for women founders. So anybody that is a female founder and anybody that wants to be, is a founder in general, I think could go there, but it's a Viral Dana event. And then there's a affiliate event on Friday morning about gender equity in our entrepreneurial ecosystem, and that's going to be at the library. So I just wanted to make people aware of that because I think it's a follow-on to what we're discussing here today. Thank you.
Hi. The phrase doctors are often the worst patients.
Yeah.
I'm curious of all the things that you kind of teach and preach to your people that listen to you. What are the things that you struggle with personally with your own business that are tough for you to kind of take your own medicine?
So I hate asking people for help. It's funny, I tell people all the time to ask for help, right? And so leverage your network, write those marketing emails. And so I feel physically ill if I have to write an email asking for help. And so a couple things. That's why I need a co-founder who does that really well. So there's a book called Eat That Frog or Eat the Frog? And the idea is like you just do that really uncomfortable thing
Right.
first thing in the morning. And so I have like a 30-minute block where I have to send out like 10 marketing emails or 10 biz dev emails, whatever the case may be, but I hate it, right? And so I have hustled in my career, but it's like very uncomfortable for me to do so. I think maybe that's why I talk about it so much, because it's like the hardest thing for me.
I do think, just on a larger topic, I think that especially for young girls, we do a terrible job of encouraging young women to ask, or, Chris Sacca has that great blog post about how he's teaching his young girls to pitch which book they want to read each night, which is a little much, but I think it's interesting how we see the result of that in a lot of areas, where we go negative on ambition in some areas, and it begins, right, it begins to work itself out or reemerge the consequences of that. So I think as we think about all of these things, right, all of our actions and how we build our ecosystems, how we interact with each other affects the ability for people to do things later in life. And so there's all sorts of ways that we can change it, especially in an ecosystem that is of more manageable size that we are. So
yeah, and it's just back to the gender thing. So when I went back to Columbia almost 5 years ago now, I had to sit in a lot of classes to like observe how professors were teaching, and I was getting kind of bored because I'd taken some of the classes before, and so I started counting the comments by women, and something that shouldn't be surprising is the class is 30% women, about 10% of the comments are coming from women. That's not surprising. But what was surprising to me is that in a 90-minute class, I would notice that if there were 10 comments made by women, 8 of them were made in the second half of class. And there's something around like women having to warm up. And then I started noticing this pattern over and over again. So I put a call out for applications to be my TA. And then we have an investment associate role that we hire for every 6 months. And I've noticed over and over again that the first resumes that come in are always from men. And that the women come in. So if I say I have a deadline on March 25th, like it's like a very, very clear curve. And I mean, I don't exactly know why that is, but another piece of advice that I've been given more is just like, I don't know, is it like women want to have their resume perfect? Like, I don't know what it is. You have to like psych yourself up to speak. I don't really care like why, but stop doing it, right? And so like send the email faster or whatever the case may be, because especially for our investment associate role, women will lose out because I'll say you have a week to send in your applications, but we'll get overwhelmed with resumes, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to shut it off on day 4. And then guess what, like you don't get those extra 3 days, and so like speed is rewarded sometimes, and so that's something else that, kind of to answer your earlier question, that I've just observed as well.
And obviously there's, if you're in, pitching,
Yeah.
so that you can't wait to warm up until the end, or if you're in a business meeting, you can't wait until,
Exactly.
the end to speak up if the business meeting could be over. All right, got a question right there.
Well, thanks for the panel. It's great. Women entrepreneurs rock. First of all, I may start with that one. So what I want to hear about is the resilience factor. So like, tell me about like how women differ from men for like high up on the entrepreneurship side. Maybe you can give me an example from your experience, like how did you get back up? Because entrepreneurs like always like facing failure, and actually how fast you can get back up with that failure is actually making you stronger and learn. But maybe a perspective from your personal experience will explain a little better.
So the idea, the questions around failure and how failure is a very popular topic these days, but I find it's always like somebody talking about like a failure they had 10 years ago, right? But they're on stage and they're like fantastically successful and talking about something that happened 10 years ago. Like that's not useful. And then every time I talk to founders, it's always like, I'm crushing it, I'm rocking it, like everything's amazing. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like I know your life sucks right now because just being a founder sucks sometimes. And I think that like what we should just all be doing, and this is like cuts across gender and diversity lines, is we just need to be talking about failure, right? And so, for example, I was really excited about, I'm putting together a book proposal, and I was really, really excited about this one agent, and she sent me a decline letter last Thursday, right? And I sent out my book proposal now to about a dozen people, and about half of them have said no. That sucks, right? And I'm living that right now. But like, we need to talk about like failure as it's happening to us right now. And again, that cuts across every single diversity lens, but I think we need to stop talking about the failure that we've overcome. Talk about the failure that you're like living right now. Like right now this person's not calling me back and it sucks. Or right now I just lost a really big client and that sucks. And I think until we start having that conversation, failure, this is like terrible thing that this like shadowy thing in our past from 5 years ago, talk about the stuff that you're struggling with right now.
Another question.
Hi.
So I would like to talk about, I mean, if you could comment, you said angels are impatient with kind of, investing and seeing the exit. And there's also saying, nail it, then scale it. So have you seen that impatience impacting that trajectory and then forcing founders to scale it and then we will nail it eventually?
So I think the angels being impatient. So venture capital funds are they're 10 years. It's a 10-year fund. And so there's just a patience built into the actual fund structure. I think that's one. I don't know. So one thing I will say that I think there's a bit of a chicken or the egg is that you need traction, in your case, nailing it, to get funding, but then you need funding to get traction. There's just real tussle, I think, for founders. And so the art of the pitch to, there's a question over here before, is knowing how to kind of frame your current progress as traction, right? And so I think an example of that is it's B2B is really tough for seed stage, right? Because it just takes longer to get a big corporation to give you, a deal than it is to get one consumer. And so traction for B2B startups is actually really hard in the early stage. And so have an LOI, right? And have an email even. It doesn't have to be a signed letter, but an email from the corporation, from the VP of product from some companies saying that, when you build out features A, B, and C, I'll pay $10 an employee a month, right? Or I'll pay $10,000 a month, whatever the case may be. But I think founders have to be creative about framing whatever progress they have as progress, because sometimes it's not always dollars and cents. And I think a lot of angels will only invest post-revenue. What we say is we'll invest post-proof of concept. But proof of concept can take a lot of different forms. And on the B2C side, a mistake I see a lot of founders make is that they're oh, I have 20,000 downloads of my app. Well, how did you get those? Oh, we were written up in TechCrunch, or we were featured in the App Store for a week. That is not scalable and replicable. I would much rather you have 1,000 customers, but you know that 300 came from this Facebook ad campaign, and now I know that these 3 keywords bump up my customer conversion. I did a booth at a trade show, and I know that 1,000 people walked by, and 200 people gave me their email address, and then I sent these 200 people this email, and these 200 people this email, and this is what worked. Right? That's what I want to see as an investor, not tons and tons of traction. So I think that helps to getting around the we won't invest until you've shown a lot of traction thing. I have no idea if I answered your question or not. Yeah.
All right, we're going to wrap it up after this question.
Okay. No pressure to ask an awesome question.
This is all right. I'll do my best. So you mentioned transparency and failures. Have you personally, or do you know anyone who's invested in companies that actually have a very transparent record of failures, even failures that they haven't overcome? Because I know that this is the challenge I see is yes, we all need to be very transparent about what hasn't worked in order to make progress. But there's a loss of face whenever we do that. So I want to know, as an investor, are you able to sort of overcome that in order to actually invest in companies that have an open transparency about that?
Absolutely, right? So in case you guys can't tell, I like studies and data. So the data shows that a second-time founder who failed the first time is an equal risk profile as a first-time founder. So you are no more likely to be successful or a failure if you failed the first time. It's the same as if you're a first-time founder. That's what the data shows. So for that case, that's one reason why I'm okay with it. And I think the more nuanced answer is that it really depends on how you talk about that failure, right? So what happened in that startup? Right, so my third startup was a big failure because we just couldn't get the B2B part to work. We got the B2C part to work, but the B2B is where the money was going to come, and we never figured out how to sell into corporations. In our case, higher ed institutions, and I have a whole conversation about that, but I learned from that, right? And so I think it's really about, do you own up to the failure? Did you learn from it? And hopefully, will that make you more successful? But it's much more about owning up to it rather than digging your heels in and being no failure here, right? And that doesn't work.
We're going to wrap it up. I just want to say one thing. So you're talking about that company you failed and being transparent about it. So I was researching you on your LinkedIn page. I don't see any of your companies on your LinkedIn page on your profile listed as your startups.
Those marketing emails in the morning.
Yeah.
What? So I'm just curious, is that something, does that, why is that, and does that play into that thought?
That's a good point.
If
You're
you,
right.
I don't know, on your LinkedIn profile.
I don't know why my startups aren't on my LinkedIn profile. I think one is 3 of them were bootstrapped, so sometimes I feel inauthentic as a founder sometimes because I didn't have that crazy big exit, even though I've hit a lot of singles and doubles in my career, but I've never hit a crazy home run. And so I actually probably think I feel a little bit of inauthenticity around that. But beyond that, I think it's probably late. The LinkedIn profile specifically is probably just laziness. I don't have a very good LinkedIn profile in general. I have many jobs missing. But I think the more honest answer is I think there is that I don't feel super authentic about calling myself a founder.
Well,
not to end on a super depressing.
And on an honest. But I think we're gonna wrap it up.
Yeah.
I really want to let's give one more big stand-up round of applause to Angela.